Hey, thank you, Rox. Is the volume okay? All right. Well, I'm really thrilled to see such a great turnout here today, especially with spring break so close, right around the corner. Thanks, everyone, for coming to talk with me about the theme of international justice. My name is Haley Duschinski. I'm a cultural anthropologist here at Ohio University. I'm in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And I'm also the director of the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture. How many of you have heard of the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture here on campus? Okay, a couple of people. The Center for Law, Justice, and Culture is a fairly new center. It's an interdisciplinary teaching and research center that spans disciplines and departments across the arts and sciences and even beyond. Basically, the center is a community of students and faculty who are committed to the study of law and justice in relation to society, culture, politics, and power. We're interested in these dynamics in domestic contexts. We're interested in these dynamics in international, global contexts. So if any of you have an interest in our projects, our initiatives, our curricula, then please look us up on the internet and come to some of our events. You're welcome to email me if you'd like more information. We've been expanding the center this year with a lot of really exciting programming and events relating to law and justice, domestically and internationally. We just had a panel discussion a few days ago on the topic of gender and protest in non-Western societies as part of Empowered Women of Ohio Week. Actually, the week after spring break, if you'll allow me to push this a little bit, we're very excited because we have a visiting lecturer coming to campus. Her name is Anita Sarkeesian. She's a feminist cultural critic and blogger who is going to be talking with us about gender and sexual harassment in the digital age. That's the Thursday we get back from spring break, Thursday, March 13th at 5 o'clock at Baker Theater. So you'll be seeing these flyers all over campus starting Monday after we get back from spring break. We also have a certificate program for undergraduate students, a certificate program focusing on law, justice, and culture. It's a selective certificate program. The selection process takes place in fall semester of each year. So if you're interested in becoming part of the center through the certificate program, please keep an eye out for those announcements next fall and consider submitting an application, okay? And again, you're welcome to email me if you have any questions about this. So today, though, I'm actually here to talk with you about the topic of imagining international justice. What do we mean when we talk about justice? What do we mean when we talk about justice here at the Science Cafe? Justice itself can be a really slippery category. It can be very abstract, the idea, the concept of justice. It can be very subjective. It can mean different things to different people, to different groups of people. Justice is the kind of category, the kind of concept that slips away just as you start to grasp it. It's the kind of concept that becomes blurry and obscure just as you start to focus your attention on it. I'm a social scientist, a cultural anthropologist, which means that when I ask questions about justice, I approach it not as an abstract category, but rather as a social fact, a normative category, an institutional practice. I approach justice as a collective kind of framework, something that's historically constructed, that's culturally produced, that has meaning for people in their local contexts, something that shapes people's memories about the past and shapes people's aspirations for the future. Justice in this sense is something that communities of people live and imagine in particular ways. And justice is increasingly something that communities of people around the globe are engaging with in all of these ways in their everyday lives. This is especially true for societies that are coming through years, even decades, of conflict, war, genocide, human rights abuse. A sociologist named Catherine Sakink has recently written a book about what she calls the justice cascade. And she refers to this as a dramatic shift in the contemporary period in the legitimacy of the norms of individual criminal accountability for human rights violations and an increase in action on behalf of these norms. What does she mean by this? Sakink, is this working? Yeah. Sakink is particularly interested in her analysis in looking at two major forms of justice interventions. And these are what we might think of as international justice. She's interested in trials, both domestic trials, trials that take place at the national level, and international trials. And she's also interested in truth commissions. So Sakink in her research did a survey of truth commissions and trials across a period of about 25 years. She looked at 1979 to 2004. She surveyed 192 different countries, and she found that of these countries, 34 of them had had truth commissions, and 50 of them had had at least one kind of international justice trial. Some of these are domestic and some are international. All of them dealing, though, with episodes of state violence, genocide, war, and human rights violations. This is kind of an amazing number. It represents a sharp increase over previous periods of time, and a new kind of wave, which she calls a cascade of international justice. These numbers became especially stark when she looked at 85 what we call new and or transitional countries, countries that are newly emerging democracies or that are transitioning into democracies. And she found that of these 85, well over 2/3 had either trials or truth commissions as justice interventions. And of course, justice, international justice, doesn't only include trials and truth commissions. It can also include many other mechanisms that people might pursue as part of a justice project at the local level in post-conflict societies. Justice, if we think about it more broadly, can also include outreach campaigns, educational initiatives, memorialization projects, even street demonstrations and street protest. These can all be ways in which communities of people in transitioning societies make claims for justice and demand justice. These are all ways in which people do the work of justice. Given this justice cascade, it's critically important for us to think about not only how people live through conditions of war and conflict, but also how people live through conditions of justice during periods of ongoing conflict and also during periods after the conflict has ended. So in my talk today, I'm going to focus on how a few specific communities of people imagine the meanings, the possibilities, the complexities and contradictions of international law and human rights, in particular, legal and cultural context. Now, I've selected just two different cases to focus on today. First, I'm going to spend most of the talk focusing on the case of Northern Ireland. This is largely because I'm preparing to lead a study abroad program on human rights, law, and justice in Northern Ireland this spring break. I'm leaving with 22 students on Friday, day after tomorrow. So this is on my mind. It's something I've been thinking a lot about and working through. And second, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk just a little bit about Cambodia. This is because I'm also in the process of developing a student-faculty research project, a program in Cambodia this summer. I'm working with 6 undergraduate students and my colleague Christine Su, the director of Southeast Asian Studies, to run this project in May and June. So we're in the process of preparing for that. I'll address some of those concerns as well. As I talk about these cases, I want to highlight a couple of issues such as how people imagine international justice, how they make and contest justice claims, how they put these claims into action as they pursue collective movements and mobilizations. Does that make sense? Okay. So first, I'll just talk a little bit about the case of Northern Ireland. How many in the room have been to Northern Ireland? A couple of people. How many were on the study abroad spring break Northern Ireland trip last year? Anybody? Anybody going this year? Okay, one. Okay, good. So I'll just talk a little bit about the background of Northern Ireland to give you a sense of the local context, the historical context, but then I'll focus mainly on what's been happening in the aftermath of the conflict there, known as the Troubles, and how some of these mobilizations have come about, the kind of work that they've been pursuing. First of all, just some basic kind of background on Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, the population is about 1.7 million people, 1.7 million in a territory about the size of Connecticut, just to give you an idea. Northern Ireland itself is not an independent state. It's not an independent country. It's also not part of the Republic of Ireland, right? Which is where you find Galway, where you find Dublin. Instead, Northern Ireland is one of 4 countries of the United Kingdom, the others being Britain, England, Wales, and Scotland, right? It's part of the UK. On the northern part of the island that encompasses the Republic of Ireland. Some people call Northern Ireland Ulster, other people call it the 6 counties. Northern Ireland actually is made up of 6 counties on the island out of the original 32 counties. So you can see this on the map a little bit. Northern Ireland is known for a lot of things. It's known for its rich cultural heritage. It's known for its very vibrant artistic and cultural traditions. It's known for its complex socio-political history. Perhaps what it's most well known for in the modern period is its history of the Troubles. Now today, Northern Ireland is going through a real renaissance, an artistic and cultural renaissance, as it emerges from decades and decades of conflict and resistance and war, armed struggle, known locally as the Troubles. Okay? Belfast is the capital city of Northern Ireland. It's the city that's most closely associated with the Troubles. It's Northern Ireland's largest city with a population of about 300,000 residents. If you look at Greater Belfast, it's about 500,000. Belfast itself has been one of the great war zones, city-urban war zones of the 20th century. For decades, it was known as one of the cities that began with a B: Belfast, Beirut, Baghdad, and Belgrade, where you simply could not go, where travelers simply couldn't visit because they were so racked with warfare. Today, Belfast is emerging from that legacy of troubles, and you can see in the photographs some of the contrast between the black and white photographs that were taken by news agencies during the 70s and 80s, the height of the Troubles, and Belfast today, kind of much more colorful pictures. Also, there's a very active tourism campaign as the country tries desperately to bring people to Northern Ireland to show them how much the society has been transformed. Now, Belfast continues to be, it has been, and it continues to be one of the world's divided cities. And in this sense, it's similar to other divided cities, cities like Beirut, cities like Lebanon, Jerusalem, also Mostar, cities that are starkly divided into different communities in which this division is written onto the urban city space. So what this means for Belfast today is that the city is currently maintained, the peace in Belfast is currently maintained by very real walls, walls made of bricks, walls made of concrete, that separate the two divided communities. These walls are known as the peace walls, somewhat ironically. They're topped with concertina wire. There are gates that close and lock down at sunset to make sure that people from different communities don't have the opportunity to cross the walls after dark, with the idea that violence and conflict would ensue. The gates are also locked whenever tensions start to arise in the city. These walls are decorated by murals that line both sides of them, very, very elaborate, colorful, very expressive, very symbolic, meaningful murals that community members themselves, in most cases, have actually created and painted on the walls. So these murals represent the priorities, concerns, passions, aspirations of the different community. They're messages that the communities are sending to themselves and also to the outside world. One stretch of the Peace Wall is the most well-known. That's a stretch of the Peace Wall in one of the major central areas of Belfast. It's decorated with murals from communities that have lived through war and conflict and violence in other parts of the world, right? So artists from Palestine, artists from the United States, artists from the former Yugoslavia have gone and created murals that express their own society's interest in a kind of an expression of solidarity. Okay. Now there's another city that I'm going to talk a little bit about today called Derry. Derry is the second largest city in Northern Ireland. It's really a large town. Derry is one of the most historic cities in all of Europe. It's a walled city. The walls there date to the 17th century. Like Belfast, Derry remains a divided city. Derry itself is known as the city that was the start of the Troubles in 1968, when civil rights protesters, largely students like yourselves, young people in their teens and early 20s, launched a movement to free Derry from British occupation and what they perceived as British colonial rule. Derry is also the home then to the Bloody Sunday Massacre, which some of you might have heard about. Today, Derry is a key city for the ongoing peace process. Okay? Now, I just want to say a little bit about what I mean by a divided society in the case of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is divided into two different communities, two different groups, right? These groups are typically kind of glossed through reference to their religious identity, Protestants and Catholics. The conflict in Northern Ireland is not necessarily about religion, but these religious categories do have significance in relation to the history of the Troubles. So when we talk about what it means to be Catholic and we talk about what it means to be Protestant in Northern Ireland, we're not just talking about religious belief or practice, we're talking about a whole kind of complex of political, economic, historical, and cultural signifiers. The country, Northern Ireland society is roughly divided about almost 50-50 in terms of population. These figures are pretty contested, but it seems as though the population is about 55% Protestant and 45% Catholic. Religious identity is historically tied to the political tensions that emphasize different elements of the Troubles. So Protestant identity is associated with what's known as a loyalist position, and Catholic identity is associated with what's known as a Republican position. So Catholics typically would represent the Republican position, Protestants would represent the loyalist position. And these identities are expressed in so many ways, like the murals that I mentioned, also different styles of dress, different ways of using language, different kinds of food habits, different kinds of music, commitment to different flags that represent different countries. In a nutshell, Republicans, representing the Catholic kind of religious commitment, want Northern Ireland to join the Republic of Ireland, right? So Catholic Republicans feel that Northern Ireland should be part of the Republic of Ireland, that their capital city should be Dublin, the capital of the Republic of Ireland. They strongly identify with their Irish heritage. They fly the Irish flag. They listen to Irish music. And they view the conflict as a struggle for their own self-determination. The loyalist side, which represents the Protestant identity, wants to preserve the union of Northern Ireland with the UK. They strongly identify with their British heritage. They claim a constitutional right to the land. And they resist what they perceive as the threat of a united Ireland, okay? So this has a lot of social and historical background to it, but that's basically what the divided society kind of breaks down into. Now, when we talk about the Troubles, we're talking about the ethno-political conflict between Republicans and Loyalists in Northern Ireland that lasted roughly from 1969 to 1998. So that's a period of about 30 years. There were key issues that related to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, the long history of institutionalized discrimination against Catholic communities in Derry, in Belfast, and throughout the region by a government that was dominated by Protestant loyalists who were affiliated with the UK. The Troubles actually began in the city of Derry. They began as a civil rights movement in the town. The name of the town is contested. Catholics call it Derry. Protestants call it Londonderry, typically. But Derry was the site of a long history of discrimination. Very discriminatory anti-Catholic laws had been in place since the 19th century in Derry that led to the frustration of many members of the Catholic community in the town. Catholic nationalists in Northern Ireland launched a massive civil rights campaign starting in 1967. So this civil rights campaign grew, swelled, and developed over the late 1960s as more and more Republicans came out in the streets demanding an end to these discriminatory laws relating to housing, relating to voting rights, access to occupation, access to education. The movement became larger and broader. In 1968 and 1969, the police started responding with force and attacking peaceful demonstrators in the streets. Tensions escalated until 1969 when the British Army was called in to try to quell the tensions. When the Army first came into Derry, the Catholic demonstrators at first offered very enthusiastic support to the arrival of the Army because they viewed the Army as the potential kind of peacekeeping force, a professionalized army that would help them create a space for peaceful demonstrations and de-escalate the tensions against a local police force that was seen as being more oppressive. Okay? So in the town of Derry itself, the residents of one of the Catholic neighborhoods, even at this time, especially at this time, right, the neighborhoods were separated into different religious communities. So the residents of one of the Catholic neighborhoods of the city called the Bogside declared it Free Derry, a free space, a space that would operate outside of the dictates of British law, British state governance. They refused to recognize the authority of the Northern Ireland government in Free Derry. And they painted a large mural on a wall declaring it Free Derry. And in this move, they were really taking a cue from movements that were happening around the world in the late 1960s. They were very cognizant of these kind of movements for civil rights and civil liberties. They were especially influenced by People's Movement in Northern California and Berkeley, kind of Free Berkeley movement, and they embraced many of these ideas. They opposed state policies that were viewed as being very oppressive, such as the detention of protesters without trial, known as internment, rigging, electoral wards to favor certain voters. And this led to what's become known as Bloody Sunday, which is probably the massacre in Northern Ireland that has the most name recognition for people today. Bloody Sunday happened in late January, January 30th, 1972. The anniversary of Bloody Sunday was just a few weeks ago. As tensions were escalating, 10,000 people gathered in Derry for a civil rights march. The army established barricades to block their route to the city center, and so they gathered in the Bogside, the Catholic neighborhood, here at the Free Derry corner around the mural. Army soldiers came in and opened fire with live bullets on the peaceful protesters. This is a familiar story. I'm sure many of you have heard it before. Through that shooting, 13 people died on the spot. The youngest age, I believe, was 14 years old, right? So these were teenagers, primarily people in their early 20s. 13 more were wounded. Another died soon afterwards of wounds. The army claimed immediately afterwards that their soldiers had opened fire after coming under fire themselves, whereas the people of the Bogside claimed that everyone had been engaged in peaceful demonstration and that this had been a case of unprovoked murder. The British government, the next day, with international scrutiny on them, announced that it would hold a public inquiry into the circumstances that were surrounding the shooting to try to find out what had happened. So this led to what's known as a tribunal, the Lord Widgery Tribunal, which took place then immediately after Bloody Sunday in 1972. It's more common in the United Kingdom to have these types of state-sponsored inquiries. Here it's known as a tribunal, a state-sponsored inquiry into these kinds of episodes of state-sponsored violence or acts of state violence that enter into kind of the public domain in certain ways that have certain salience and meaning for people, right? So this is a technique that the British government is more likely to use than we are here in the United States. A British Lord Chief Justice, Lord Widgery, was appointed to carry out this inquiry. He himself is a former Army brigadier, and he called it a fact-finding exercise. So he spent less than a month investigating the circumstances that had led to Bloody Sunday. He traveled to a town near Derry, talked to some people to find out what had happened, and wrote a report which basically exonerated the army of any wrongdoing in the situation, and then actually blamed the civil rights organizations for organizing what he termed an illegal march. The report cast suspicion on the victims, claiming that they had been carrying bombs and guns with them in their pocket when local march participants disputed the veracity of this. The Widgery report put an end, from the state's perspective, into the inquiry, and the report itself deeply angered nationalists. Relatives of those who had been killed, and also members of the wider nationalist community, called the report a whitewash, experienced it as a second form of violence after the initial violence that had been enacted, and started launching demands that escalated over the subsequent decades for a fresh public inquiry. Now, after that, the troubles continued. Bloody Sunday is kind of seen as the turning point. After that, situation escalated, and especially escalated in Belfast, throughout Northern Ireland, through the 70s and the 1980s, until the 1990s. A ceasefire was declared in 1993, 1994, and after a few years of a ceasefire, the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998, in which an agreement on the governance of Northern Ireland was finally reached. Now, it's been 15 years since the institution of the Good Friday Agreement, but Northern Ireland remains a divided society. As you can tell from the photographs of the divided cities and the peace walls, the very fact that these gates, this barbed wire, these walls themselves are necessary to continue to maintain the peace. Victims' families in particular are still struggling. Victims' families relating to Bloody Sunday, but so many other acts of state violence and massacre, also violence carried out by non-state actors, are still really struggling to do this work of seeking justice for the injustices of the past. So the situation in Northern Ireland, the post-conflict situation, 15 years after the peace accords, still raises a lot of challenges. Challenges of truth recovery in a divided society, challenges of memorialization projects and heritage projects in a post-conflict society, challenges about negotiating a shared space between communities that are so starkly divided, and the challenges of negotiating what are really highly charged political symbols in a potentially very volatile post-conflict setting. So in 1992, the family members of those who had been killed in the Bloody Sunday massacre really began a very concerted effort to establish a new inquiry into what had happened on that day in Derry. They formed a citizens action group called the Bloody Sunday Trust, and they started doing this work of trying to slowly, gradually apply pressure to the British government to garner the support of the international community to try to bring the second inquiry about. And this was a real challenge for them. These were families who came from working class backgrounds, who had really no experience dealing with international political affairs. In the years and even in the decade or two after Bloody Sunday, the society had been so racked by conflict that there had not really been space for these victims' family members to come out publicly and to do this kind of work of seeking justice. So it was only after 1992 that they really began to try to learn how to do this. This involved a lot of kind of creativity and innovation on their part. They had to reach out to other victims' family groups in Northern Ireland, across Europe, and across the world more generally to try to learn lessons, to get advice, and to seek guidance. And they ultimately were successful in establishing, first of all, a museum in Derry at the site of the Bloody Sunday Massacre itself. It's a museum of Free Derry that's dedicated to the victims and that portrays their version of history of what happened on that day, and really their version of the history of the struggle and the Troubles itself. Again, this is a history that for many decades had no space to be told, right? Because the historical narrative was dominated by the state perspective. So the museum today is growing, it's very strong. They have an increasing number of visitors every year. And they also were successful in achieving a second inquiry. This is a remarkable story because it's the first time in the history of the United Kingdom that there has been a second inquiry into an episode of state violence for any kind of situation. So this was a big victory for the Bloody Sunday Trust. In 1998, Prime Minister Tony Blair agreed to establish a new inquiry. It lasted for 12 years. It was headed by Lord Savile, who oversaw the affair. They began public hearings in March of 2000. These lasted for 5 years. Nearly 1,000 people gave direct evidence. There was a massive amount of evidence, eyewitness testimony, audio, video evidence. And finally, a report came out in 2010. This report, in contrast to the Widgery report, established the innocence of the victims and really laid responsibility for the massacre itself on the army. When he was releasing the report, the Prime Minister, now at this time David Cameron, apologized to the people and the community in Derry and called the killings unjustified and unjustifiable. This was experienced as an immense relief for the families that had been fighting for this for so many years. The families of the victims of Bloody Sunday really felt that the findings vindicated those who had been killed. A certain conflict is still kind of remaining today, though, because now the Savile inquiry has been released, the truth has come out. The soldiers who are responsible were not named in the report, although everyone in Derry knows their names and know who they are, right? But they were not named in the report, so that's perceived as a problem by some family members. And also now there's remains this question of prosecution, whether or not any kind of trials will be held to attribute responsibility for the state violence. Some family members feel that they are satisfied that they've achieved justice in their eyes through this report itself, establishing the truthful record, whereas others are still continuing to push for prosecution. So that's an issue that's ongoing today. What I find most remarkable about this story is the process itself through which the Savile inquiry was carried out. As I said, it took place over 12 years. For much of this time, it was actually located in the city of Derry. This wasn't an inquiry that kind of went in and interviewed people in an isolated way, collected evidence in an isolated way. Instead, it became very much a community project. In the city of Derry, there's Guildhall is kind of like the city hall. It's an old historic building people feel a strong connection to. It's kind of a symbolic representation of Derry itself. Guildhall became kind of the headquarters for the inquiry. And they went in and set it up in a certain way in a big kind of common room. The panel of judges led by Lord Savile were at the front. And then there was a large kind of seating area for members of the community, for journalists, for anyone who was interested. All of the proceedings were public. People from throughout the community came and gave eyewitness testimony, right? I said nearly 1,000 people testified. So the community itself was very much engaged in this truth-seeking process. The proceedings were all filmed and then projected in local movie theaters. So if you couldn't make it to Guildhall, you could go to a theater near your neighborhood and you could watch it projected on the big screen. This was like, for many, many years, the entire town of Derry was very committed to this inquiry and to seeking the truth and seeking justice. The army soldiers themselves were not willing to fly to Derry to be part of the proceedings. So in those cases, Lord Savile and the panel had to go to London and set up a second kind of session there over the course of a couple of years. And the family members talked to us about how they all went with them, right? The government paid for them to go too because it was so important for them to go face the soldiers who had killed their loved ones, be part of the process, and to be in the room while these decisions were being made. So they really committed 12 years of their life just to this inquiry after having already spent so many years pushing for it to happen. And they remain very much involved in it today. You can see here in these pictures, the picture at the top here is the crowd that, that kind of gathered around Guildhall as they were waiting for the results of the report to be released, a massive crowd. Gathered around Guildhall, and you can see here another kind of version of it. And this is from their website. They have a very active, a very kind of a full website with a lot of documentation and a lot of publications on the Savile inquiry. So that represents a kind of success story of a victims advocacy group pushing for justice, doing the work of justice at the local level in relation to a specific kind of context of violence. I just want to talk about one other case more briefly relating to Northern Ireland to show some of the complexities that can arise in such cases. And this is the case of Omagh and the Omagh Memorial. Omagh is a small town in Northern Ireland where one of the worst episodes of violence throughout all of the Troubles took place. And this actually took place in 1998, just very, very briefly after the peace agreement was signed. In this instance, a splinter group of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, a splinter group that resisted the IRA's willingness to engage in a ceasefire, kind of a more radical offshoot of the IRA, resisted the peace process and set off a car bomb in this town of Omagh that killed 29 people and injured over 200 more. It was a car bomb that went off in a really heavily trafficked area of the city during a very busy time of day. This picture at the top is a street scene. This is the location where the car bomb took place. And this really, really shook up people in Omagh and throughout Northern Ireland, especially as people were kind of in the process of celebrating the peace agreement that had just been signed. It was a great shock to many people throughout the town. And it really threatened to destabilize the peace process for a couple of years after that. So shortly afterwards, the victims' families organized into a nonprofit group called the Omagh Self-Help and Support Group with the sole purpose of seeking justice for their loved ones who had been killed in the car bombing. They expressed frustration at the time, and they continue to express frustration today because they feel that no real adequate inquiry has been carried out into the circumstances surrounding the car bombing, that there's been no really committed effort from the state government to try to identify the perpetrators and hold them accountable for their violence. They feel that this is because of political reasons, because the act of identifying and prosecuting the perpetrators would threaten to destabilize the kind of peaceful equilibrium that's been established in Northern Ireland. So the family members involved in this group say that they're not going to rest until the individuals who are responsible for the car bomb have been identified and held responsible for their actions. So these slides show a memorial that's been developed in the town of Omagh, and this is a really interesting story. This gives us a different kind of idea of memorialization, how it works, and how complex it can be. This memorial was established 10 years after the car bombing itself in 2008. And it was the product of a search. The political leaders in the town of Omagh sent out a call for proposals for a memorial. They sent it out far and wide, and they evaluated all of the proposals came in. They identified a design team from Dublin to build the memorial. So the design team came and built the memorial that they had proposed. They did this without any kind of input or consultation or real engagement with the victims' family members themselves, the victims' family members who have been very involved in this cause of justice for so many years. So this memorial is an interesting memorial site. It has two different components to it. Here there is a very tall glass structure with a heart in the middle. It's a clock tower, and that's been posted at the site of the car bombing itself. And then around the corner, you can see on that slide, up at the top is where the glass tower is. And then around the corner and down the street is a memorial garden. There's a reflecting pool. It's an area that suggests peaceful reflection and isolation and seclusion. It's surrounded by a series of mirrors on this side. See how there's mirrors on the top of those long poles? And on this side as well. So the idea is that when the sun shines in, it bounces around back and forth off of these mirrors, and then ultimately projects up the street where there's another mirror, and then onto the glass tower, right? This is an impressive design. In reality, the victims' family members say that they have a lot of problems with this design. They say, first of all, it doesn't work, that it's too much to expect the light to be reflected all of the way, and that it actually doesn't, it's not effective in practice. They also point out that Omagh is one of the towns in Northern Ireland that receives the least amount of sunlight throughout the year. So it's kind of counterintuitive to even have this be the basis of the memorial. And they also point out that this site of the reflection pool has no meaning or significance for them. It's a kind of isolated spot on the side of a heavily trafficked, I think a 2 or 4 lane road. There's no stop on the road. There's nowhere to park and get out of your car. There's really no way to access it, and there's no reason for people to go there. So they say that in practice, the memorial site is unused throughout the year, that they have no reason to go there, and that other people have no reason to go there either, except for every year on the anniversary day where there's a memorialization kind of, there's a commemoration event that largely seems to be directed by the political leaders in the town, those who arranged for this to be built, and that they feel often excludes the family members. So this is a point of real contestation for the town of Omagh, and it's the kind of contestation that can continue to raise tensions, fuel divisions. This is the kind of thing that the family members are having to work through actively as they seek justice. So this gives us an example of what we might consider a memorial that doesn't quite work, that doesn't quite do the justice that perhaps we imagined that it could. Am I okay on time? 6:40. 6:40? 5:40. Okay, good. Actually, I'll just wrap up quickly by saying a little bit, just really briefly, I just want to gesture towards this. Those are just a couple of examples of the kind of work of justice that's happening on the local level in the case of Northern Ireland. The other case that I just want to mention quickly is the case of Cambodia. Cambodian society is still doing very, very difficult work to emerge from a legacy of genocide that took place in the late 1970s through the destructive policies of the Khmer Rouge regime. So there's been a lot of justice work going on in Cambodia for several decades. There's a massive international tribunal that is continuing to be carried out in Cambodia to really identify and hold responsible the architects of the Khmer Rouge regime. So talk of justice, talk of genocide is very much a kind of driving force, a strong condition of everyday life in Cambodia. And there are a couple of human rights organizations that are local human rights organizations that are working in conjunction with these large-scale or national initiatives, but are also doing work at the community level, at the grassroots level, on the ground, in order to try to pursue justice against the grain, to kind of think differently about how justice might be conceived. The most well-known of these is a group called the Documentation Center of Cambodia. This is a Cambodian-based human rights NGO, non-governmental organization. They've done a lot of work around justice issues in Cambodia. They're headquartered in the capital city of Phnom Penh. They, for example, did a mapping project of all of the sites where the genocide took place, almost 20,000 mass burial pits. They mapped all of the prisons. They also mapped all of the memorials that have been built, some that are very well known, some that are not well known at all, local community memorials, right, in people's backyards, constructed by survivors of the regime. So just in the last couple of years, the Documentation Center of Cambodia, which is a very well-known group, internationally connected, internationally respected, has supported the development of a small kind of offshoot of DCCAM known as the Slukhrith Institute. This is thought of as the academic wing of the Documentation Center of Cambodia, and they're explicitly pursuing some of these local level justice projects. I just want to mention a couple of them. One of their major projects is that they are in the process of developing the first permanent genocide museum in Cambodia. This is something that they're just beginning. They've acquired land in one of the towns in Cambodia to build it on. And so they're in the process now of thinking about how to design the museum, what kind of story of the past to tell, how to design the exhibitions. They're also developing a school for human rights, conflict, and genocide studies. It's starting as a certificate program for Cambodian students who often don't learn much about the genocide in their regular educational curriculum. This institute feels that they should be taught their history and they should be aware of these justice-related issues. They're going to expand it, hopefully, into a master's program over the next couple of years. So this summer, My colleague here at Ohio University and I are traveling with 6 students to go work with them on these projects. We have an assortment of undergraduate students, some majoring in history, anthropology, journalism, museum studies. They have different kinds of backgrounds and different kind of skills that they can contribute. But we're going to be doing work on these projects with the staff at the Institute, and then also pursuing a range of different kinds of research projects. Each student has an independent research project to try to look at different aspects of this work, to actually look at the Slipworth Institute as an organization that's doing the work of local justice on the ground, to think about how they conceptualize justice, how they frame it, how they communicate it to the public, how they take international categories that we're all familiar with, these big ideas, these big international normative categories like human rights, like genocide, like justice. These categories, they may be internationally recognized, but they don't mean the same thing everywhere, right? So we're asking the question of what do they mean in Cambodia? What does genocide mean in Cambodia? What does human rights mean? What does justice mean? How do people imagine it? People imagine it through the work of these kinds of translator organizations, right? They're taking international categories and making them local. They're vernacularizing them, right? They're giving them a certain kind of local meaning and context. So our projects are going to be looking at that and using that as kind of a segue into this larger question of how communities imagine international justice in the way that they do. Okay, I'll stop there. I appreciate y'all's patience with me, and I'd really like to have a little bit of a conversation with you about these issues. If any of you all have anything to add or any questions? Yes? The genocide, that's a really good question. The idea behind the genocide was to try to centralize the peasant farming community of Cambodia. So different communities that didn't fit into that category were targeted. Much of the violence was targeting professional classes, urban classes, minority groups. There's a Cham Muslim minority community in Cambodia that was targeted in particular ways. So certain segments of society were decimated through that. And then those who were not targeted through the violence were separated, families, couples were separated into work camps to try to pursue this vision of a national peasant society. And so a lot of the violence then played out that way as well, right? As people were living in really difficult conditions, separated from their communities. Yeah.
About the Aramat case, you mentioned that some family members thought that justice was received in the report, but you said some thought it didn't. So I'm just wondering, like, what are they doing now? Are they continuing the mobilization process to go for prosecution, or they have just like?
No, it's interesting. It's right. So she's asking about this. In the case of the Bloody Sunday Trust, that some of the families feel that they've achieved justice through the publication of the report and the truth being established, and others are kind of still pushing for prosecution. You're asking kind of how that's playing out in terms of the movement?
Like, are they still, like, how are they, because it seems like a 12 years old project,
Yeah.
and like suddenly you have, seems like an achievement, so do they have like the energy to go for prosecution?
No, that's exactly the issue, right? So, I mean, these are really personal questions for these family members. They've committed so much of their lives to the fight, the struggle for justice, right? I mean, and it's taken an immense amount of work and an immense amount of commitment. Their entire lives have become defined by this. So for some, I think for some of the families, they feel that this is a place to stop. This is a place to say, okay, justice has been achieved and we're ready to move on now, in a way. Whereas other family members are still very much committed to fighting for, for trials. My sense is that it hasn't created a real stark tension within the family members' communities. I mean, it's a small group of family members, right? And they have this long history together. They've been through so much together. So my sense is that it hasn't created like schisms within them, but they're just having these discussions and trying to be kind of patient with each other, and to try to see things from each other's point of view. Yes.
I'm interested that in Belfast there are still these walls that stand and have to be locked at night. And it sounds to me almost like a ceasefire rather than a real truce. And I'm thinking about the contrast there with what's going on in Rwanda, where Tutsis and Hutus are actually learning to live with one another, living with the people that actually committed the genocide. And that requires a level of reconciliation that doesn't seem to be a part of what you're describing.
Right. There are a lot of different kinds of, Northern Ireland is remarkable as in terms of the kinds of justice, redress, reconciliation programs that are going on there. You can learn so much about different models, different alternatives, different projects in a really short period of time because it's an industry there, right? So there are a lot of reconciliation projects going on. They take different forms. Some of them focus on younger generations, trying to bring young students, like middle school, even high school, bring them together into the same schools. The schools are still sharply divided, so there's recognition of the fact that really the communities can't come together unless that's starting to happen in the schools. So some of the work is going on in the school systems, some of it's going on in after-school programs. The areas where the walls divide are known as interface areas. Those are areas where the groups come into interface with each other. And those are areas that are still really, really tense today. And it's in many cases, it's young people that are engaging in that kind of tension too. So the legacy of violence is still kind of playing out in a lot of ways. It's interesting to me too that many of the social agents that are most active in the reconciliation process are the former militants, the armed militants on both sides, the IRA on the nationalist side, the UVF on the loyalist side, ex-political prisoners, those who went to jail because of their political activity, because of the actions that they were engaged with during the Troubles, and then were released. Many of them were released through the peace accords. And now they've become really important members of society in trying to build these reconciliation projects and do community reconciliation projects. So they'll have ex-prisoner dialogue sessions at different places throughout the city, show that they're willing to come together and trying to model for others that they should do the same. It's interesting that ex-political prisoners are so heavily involved. And meeting with soldiers. Yeah, right. Yes?
I'm wondering if on the national scale, do these local progressions with the matter of justice help to solve the national Cambodia or
Right, so she's asking about the relationship between the local justice initiatives and the national kind of projects, the national work that's going on. That's one of the things that's so remarkable to me about these questions, and one of the things that motivates me to approach these justice issues from a local point of view is that typically national projects, and especially international projects of justice, when you see these big international tribunals going on or national level truth commissions, in many ways those projects are designed, organized, and carried out by certain stratas of society, and they really, in practice, often exclude or marginalize local communities that may have completely different understandings of justice, right? That may want something different than what the state assumes they want, or they might have different kind of claims than what the international community assumes they're claiming. Okay. So I think that sometimes some projects are better at recognizing local concerns than others, but I think that oftentimes the local communities really have to push to have their voices heard. Yes? Mm-hmm. Right. That's a really good question. My sense is that during the period of the Troubles, that the religious leaders on both sides were very active members in their communities and providing guidance and counseling and talking through issues with especially the young people who were trying to figure out what forms of action to take, whether to pursue direct action or other forms of protest and demonstration. So they have been really active participants in that way, right? And they're very prominent members in both communities. They've also been pretty important members of the peace process as well. Yeah, but again, I think in many ways that relationship has more to do with their membership in a certain community that's defined not only in terms of religion, but also in terms of these other factors. It's like a shared background, a shared heritage. Yeah. Uh-huh. There you go. Mm-hmm. Right. Right, right. There's a long history to this, and just kind of in a nutshell, from the 16th century, there was a program from Britain to settle Northern Ireland. So that meant sending over shiploads of Protestants from Scotland and primarily and from Britain who arrived on the island and claimed the land for their own and established plantations and basically kind of pushed the indigenous Irish off of the land. They had to relocate into the hills. Their land was taken from them. So this is known as the plantation settler system. And this was, during the period of like colonialism throughout the world, throughout the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. I mean, you can read the history, you should read the history of Northern Ireland in conjunction with those other histories of colonialism. So in 1916, all of Ireland was under the United Kingdom in a kind of colonial arrangement. They launched a movement for independence and freedom that over the next 10 years worked out really well for the Republic of Ireland. And they gained independence, but Northern Ireland remained attached to the UK, right? So you're exactly right, the Protestants come, so they have a very different kind of background and heritage. Now, it's been hundreds of years since the time that many of those original families came over. So there's an active contemporary reclaiming of that identity that goes on, right? But in many ways, I mean, for several hundred years, Protestants and Catholics have been living the same kind of lives in Northern Ireland, right? I mean, they're members of the same community. Yes.
You said that like the victims' families do like a memorial in Omagh. You organize the memorial, because I know a lot of times it's organized by they have some sort of bishop and they petition. So
Right. My understanding is that the political government, the local politics in this town is often very sympathetic to the Republican cause. In this particular case of violence, the car bombing, it was an offshoot of the IRA, which represents the Republican cause, that was responsible for the car bombing. So the victims' family members, who are also Catholic, right, many of them, they sense that perhaps it wasn't investigated as thoroughly because there was a kind of political, there was the sense that it would raise difficult political issues. So when the memorial was built and with the annual commemoration ceremonies that happen, those are like kind of politicized, right? They're politicized in a certain way. So it's the local political figures that are in charge of it. They're the ones that kind of orchestrated the design, they sent out the call for proposals for designing the memorial. They organized the commemoration ceremony. And it's mostly kind of like the local political leaders and the local elites that represent a certain kind of way of thinking about this that participate. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay.
We're talking about international justice and things like that. But I was wondering if we could bring it back to America.
Mm-hmm.
Discuss an issue. We've been like talking about the issues between Protestants and Catholics and things like that. I was wondering what your opinion was about in stand your ground states, like in the Jordan Davis case, and Trayvon Martin cases. Your opinion on maybe like white society and black society and how like lynchings and things like that, the issue of race.
Yeah, no.
I saw a lot of similarities, and that's what really came to my mind.
What kind of similarities did you see?
Like in the Bloody Sunday, that peaceful protesters, and in Trayvon Martin's case, that he wasn't holding a gun or anything like that, and people see George Zimmerman as like the aggressor and things like that, or wanting to know. There's a lot of people who are arguing on different sides of this Cosby argument and things like that. There's a lot of disputes and a lot of tension, and a lot of people are on either side of the issue.
Right. So he's asking a question about kind of taking these kind of models, but then also thinking about institutionalized racial discrimination in the United States, whether that's something that we can compare or use these lenses to think about in a certain way, and talking specifically about Trayvon Martin case and stand your ground laws and things like that. So one of the reasons why I think it's important for us to look at cases from non-US societies is just for this reason, because I think like looking at these cases that are not familiar, we can see certain patterns, certain conditions, certain structures that then helps us illuminate things that we might take for granted in our own society. And I think it's really important to do that comparative work. I mean, when you hear about Bloody Sunday, I'm glad that you're thinking about that, right? Because I think about that too. And I think that also when we look at these cases that we frame as human rights violations, state oppression, war, and genocide, those kinds of concepts can also help us think in different ways about institutionalized violence, institutionalized racism that we are embedded in every day here in the United States, right? And those same kinds of frameworks can really help us think through it differently and more thoroughly. An anthropologist named Nancy Shepherd Hughes has a concept that she calls the continuum of genocide. She says that we tend to think of genocide as being a singular kind of extreme event that represents something that's unrelated to other forms of mass violence or institutionalized racism. She says, institutionalized violence. But she makes the argument that we need to think about genocide as a continuum so that we can do this work of comparing up and down the spectrum, right, of things that we might not normally feel comfortable calling genocide, but that have like similar properties, similar processes, and that then we can think about responding to in similar ways. So when you're asking about Trayvon, I was really interested to follow the work of the family and the community, that kind of local work of justice that they were doing that then spread across the country, because it's a very similar kind of dynamic.
At this point, I think that there are going to be more questions for Haley, and I would encourage you to come up. But before you leave, I forgot to allow one of the people in the audience to actually give us an announcement. So I'm going to ask Maggie to come up right now, if you don't mind.
Hey guys, before you pack up, is this on? Hopefully. Thank you, Dr. Duschinski. I just wanted to continue the conversation about social justice and bring up an opportunity of pursuing local social justice issues. As maybe some of you guys know, Athens County is one of the poorest counties in the United States and the poorest county in Ohio, the state of Ohio. So one opportunity to, on a local level, look at social justice, a student organization called Service Living will be hosting a homelessness simulation the Thursday after spring break from 2 to 4 in the Baker Ballroom. So it's an opportunity for all of you to simulate within an hour or so what it might be like to live without a home, without employment, without knowing where your next meal will come from. So if that's something that you would be interested in, feel free to come talk to me after the talk is over and you've gotten your questions answered. There's a capacity of about 60 students. So if you would like to register, do so either through me talking to me afterwards, or you can register online at serviceliving@goodworks.net. So thank you guys.
Well, at this point, I think that I want to thank our speaker today. I think that it's been a really engaging talk and something that I think can sometimes be difficult. One of the things that I took home, which is from the last speaker or the last person who asked the question, was, you know, sometimes when we look at ourselves in our own context, it's very difficult for us to look at ourselves objectively. We're just too immersed in that system. So by looking at other cultures, we can form our frameworks, as you said, and then apply it to ourselves. So I would encourage you to do that at all times throughout your lives. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for coming. And there's some flyers and brochures and things for the Law Center and the Law Center events here on the table if you're interested in any of those.